We're back today for some follow-up questions from the webinar, Get Your Records Retention Schedule Under Control and Keep It That Way, a case study in global retention scheduling. We're joined again by subject matter expert Warren Beal. He's the Senior Sales Engineer at Zazio Enterprises, and Jed Chadband Massengill, who's a Senior Analyst at Zazio, as well as Greg Dinklenberg, who's the Associate Director of Records and Information Management at PRA Health Sciences. Welcome back, everyone.
Glad to be here.
Thanks, Sam.
And Happy New Year.
Yes.
So let's get right into the questions. We have quite a few to get through. And again, thank you so much for being here to do this. Question one is, how do you know your retention schedule is too complicated or overly simplified? So the both ends of the spectrum there. Warren, do you want to get us started with this one?
Sure, be glad to. I think the best way to answer that is simply, does it work? You know, can you find the record categories you're looking for? Do you get a lot of questions? You know, do you have users calling or emailing you a lot to find out, you know, where does this fit in the schedule? If you get a lot of that, it's probably not quite sufficient. Either you've made it too broad or too granular. So it's mainly sort of a functional question, I would say, is the best way to describe it.
Okay. And Greg, just as a practitioner working in the field, is that your sense as well?
Yes. I mean, if you make it too complicated, then it won't be followed. So,
or you're barraged with questions every single day.
Right, exactly, every day.
The RIM person or IG. So what we talked about this a little bit in the webinar last month. What is the sweet spot sort of for the number of record categories? I mean, roughly, every organization is of course different, but is there a rough sweet spot range?
Yeah, it's obviously subjective, and it depends on your organization and depends on your industry. But typically, I'd say that in that 100 to 200 range is pretty pretty well accepted as where you want to head. You know, Jennifer, you probably have a lot more experience with that as far as what's worked for you in terms of actually creating those schedules. But that seems to be what I've seen anyway.
Does that sound right, Jen?
I think that sounds right, Warren. Yep.
So our next question is related to this sort of number of categories and different types of approaches. What is your opinion on the so-called big bucket approach and setting a retention period that covers the most jurisdictional requirements? And I know that for a while there has been a push to do some very big bucketing. So I'd like you to touch on both of those points if you would. Can you talk about that a bit, Jen?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are really of the mindset that big bucket is kind of best practice for the industry, and that kind of circles back to this idea of the simpler the better. So with the bigger bucket, you know, functionally designed retention schedule that covers most of the jurisdictional requirements, you know, the benefit is that there is more administrative ease for the retention schedule, and then plethora of benefits also for end users. It's just easier for them to use and understand.
Can buckets get too big though? I mean, can you oversimplify and try to?
Sure. Yeah, there definitely has to be a balance struck there. You know, some of the things that we're always thinking about are event triggers. You know, the natural life cycle of records. They really, you know, kind of speak to unique event triggers, and those really do have to be taken into consideration. And then also something we're thinking about is kind of striking the right balance with retention periods. If you go a super big bucket, what you're going to end up doing is going with really long retention periods, and there could be too much over retention there, exposing the company to too much risk. And then there's also privacy considerations. So I think it's definitely striking the right balance for each client.
Okay. Well, that's great. Here's a curious one. Any tips when your IT department asks for 10 to 12 retention policies or periods when automating an electronic platform, something like SharePoint, when a user can choose an applicable schedule and they only want to present, say, 10 to 12 choices? Any thoughts on that? Warren, do you want to lead with that one?
Sure. I think, you know, from the outset, my thought when I saw that one is, you know, is IT driving your retention schedule, or is it the policy? And I think that's an important consideration. But, you know, thinking about some of the interactions I've had with our customers, I think what's really driving that is that someone in IT is probably aware that if you give users too many options, they will likely choose the wrong one, or it's just going to get complicated. So they're really trying to just narrow the choices, which is really what is sort of the driver behind departmental schedules. You want to say, well, for this department, here's all you need to know about, and that helps the user. And so it's again sort of finding that balance between the functionality and the administration of the schedule and how you implement it for the users.
And realistically, that might be possible if you've streamlined your schedule, within a single SharePoint environment, you might be able to restrict that much.
Yeah, and we have seen sort of hybrid situations where you have a functional schedule that has everything, but then in certain contexts, you can say, well, we're only going to display these record categories for this group if that's all that they need.
But I think another takeaway, just again to emphasize the point that you started with, that it should be the policy that's driving it, not IT. It's sort of seems a little backwards. So our archives, I think this is one we asked actually during the session, but just for completeness, let's get it in here. Are our archives part of the stakeholders in the interview and research process? I would think hopefully they should be.
Yeah, we don't want them to feel left out, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Part of that interview process is really making sure that you have an understanding of what records you're keeping, your company is keeping, kind of where they are, how they're being maintained, etc. So certainly archives should be part of that process, and it's always changing. So that their records are always changing as well.
Related sort of to this is, how is historical defined? Jen, can you talk about this a little?
Sure. So, as part of that kind of formal appraisal process with records, I think what our clients are looking for when they're trying to decide whether something is historical, really it's looking towards these original source records that are really important to kind of the identity, the brand, the evolution, the story of the company. So maybe it's like an original patent, or, maybe a kind of a landmark marketing campaign, for example. So it really is kind of during that appraisal process, and their value really is kind of intrinsically that it is historical. It's not business, it's not operational, there's not a legal basis for keeping those. It's just really important for the company's story.
So this next one is interesting too, about related to the types of schedules you see. Are you seeing any variable structure schedules? And they're explaining this as where the record type numbers are assigned on the fly based on specific characteristics, such as a combination of numbers, that they're very high, and it says, but only a small set of categories need to be maintained. Have you seen? I haven't seen this where I've anywhere I've worked personally.
I can't say that I have, but I'm intrigued. I'm interested. I mean, I think on its face, it sounds more complicated than simple, but I probably want to get more familiar with it. But I can't recall anything. Warren, does this ring a bell for you at all? Have you seen anything like this?
It sounds in a way like a file plan structure in more of the older form, where you had, say, open filing, open shelving, where you had to perhaps color code the files so that you could easily retrieve them and locate them. And so the numbering scheme would refer to their location or their content or the year. It's sort of in the same vein as that. It's not as necessary these days with the ability to do searches on a computer, and so we don't find that as prevalent even in the filing realms as much anymore.
So you're seeing this as that carry over more from the physical record space?
I think, it seems to relate to that.
So the question here is, the next one is, could you please define the evergreen approach and provide an example? And I think I was the one who used the term evergreen, and what I meant was, instead of waiting for your retention schedule to get out of kilter, to get out of date, to continually update it. That's what I meant by that. And that doesn't necessarily mean what you're publishing to people, but keeping the references, the citations up to date, making sure you know anything that's going to affect one of your categories and your retention periods for your next publication. But Warren, can you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, I think I understand that term just in the sense that you're always keeping it up to date versus saying, well, we're going to create a schedule and it's going to be static for a year or two. It's a matter of just always keeping up to date with regulations, with changes that are requested from users. It's sort of just keeping it as a living document rather than thinking of it as a distinct publication point that you do maybe on an annual or semi-annual basis.
And those things can be separated, the sort of keeping the material up to date so that you're on top of it, aware of anything that's relevant to your organization, and then the separate publication, the
Sure.
operationalizing it. So those things can be two distinct steps. How often, this is, I think, I think this varies for every company, but general question of how often should a schedule be reviewed as best practice? And so leading off of that last one, I think that, if you have the capability to have a kind of service that is continually giving you updates on citations, I think that's, in my mind, that's the highest level of maturity an organization can be at, so that they're on top of it all the time. But certainly, I think there are acceptable, good practices somewhere that aren't as continuous as that. Jen, would you like to comment on that one?
I'm sorry, Anne, can you repeat your question?
So it's just how often sorry, I did ramble in there to an answer. So how often should a schedule be reviewed as best
Sure.
practice? So I think
Okay.
there's a range of what is really, really good practice. Then there's optimizing. So I think
Sure.
I was saying that doing it continuously, taking an evergreen approach is more like that optimizing
Yeah.
end of the spectrum.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. So I think, first of all, this is kind of governed by the your organization's policy. And I think when they're looking, our clients, internally, and they're looking at, what's an appropriate, period of time as far as, a refresh goes. They're thinking about things, such as, what jurisdictions are we operating in? What's the regulatory nature of those jurisdictions? Do they have really aggressive oversight? Also, just, the industry in general, how heavily regulated is the industry? So I think we find that our clients that are really heavily regulated are refreshing on a more frequent basis, and that really fits their risk profile. So I think typically what we see is annual, every 1 to 3 years, 3 years being on the longer side.
Right.
Of course, for some really minimally regulated clients, we will see 5 years. So it just kind of depends.
So it's a combination of sort of their risk profile, but also internally, but also externally with respect to the kind of market that they're in.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Can someone give an example or two of state laws limiting a retention period for a type of record? Jen, I have you tagged on this.
Yes, I would love to provide some examples. So, these are always kind of, I think, with what we do, and without, I'm a little nervous to sound super nerdy here, but we love finding these types of requirements, So I'll just provide a couple examples. What we're seeing is, of course, we see a lot of them internationally, but let me just share. The question was about state laws anyway. So a great one, I think, is the Illinois law that we've seen. So it's a maximum kind of retention period no longer than 3 years, after kind of last contact or with the individual with regard to like biometric information. So there's actually been class action lawsuits based on this. For example, collecting fingerprints for, individuals checking in for their job and keeping those for too long. So there's an example right there. And we do have clients that, have made decisions for the retention schedule based on this law. I think another good example would be, and this is kind of a sneaky one, but Utah has a law which requires recruitment records collected to be retained for no longer than 2 years after that hiring decision or last contact with the individual that was applying for a position. So, that's kind of a sneaky one there. And similarly, we've had clients that have made retention schedule decisions based on that law. So there's a lot of them, actually.
All right, no, that's great. Can we elaborate for a little bit on what we talked a little bit about this interview process to sort of understand what your current situation is? Can you elaborate a little bit more on that interview process, Warren? And then also tell us what are some of the important questions that you'd like to ask stakeholders when you do that?
Sure. Yeah. So we're obviously not referring to interview for a job, but it's more about interviewing stakeholders. So if you are developing a retention schedule or revising a retention schedule, it's important to find out from the source what records are being kept, what the nature of them are, how they're being managed, how long they're being kept currently, who's generating, who's storing, et cetera. So it involves a lot of different metadata points about the records that are being kept. And so there's a lot of decision making that goes into the process of developing a retention schedule when it comes to, well, who do we interview and how many people do we need to talk to in order to make sure that we get a good cross-section of information? Do we talk to just managers? Do we talk to the individual record holders? And so that's a really important process. And it can be a combination of not only interviews, but also surveys. So you might send out surveys, say in a spreadsheet or a web form to ask questions about what records are keeping, and then follow up with interviews to fill in gaps or get clarification and so forth.
Yeah, I would imagine that is an iterative process because you don't know what you're going to encounter before you do that first round of interviews. Next one is, how many countries do you cover? And I think I have a broader question, sort of how many jurisdictions generally too, not just countries.
Yeah, so I did just check in our system today prior to this call, and we currently have 139 countries for which we have citations. That's broken out to 163 jurisdictions outside of the US, meaning that some countries will have provinces or states, and we break those out in some cases, not in all cases, because it's not always necessary. But that just gives you an idea of the breadth of the coverage that we currently have. So thanks to our legal research team, which Jen is a part of as well.
Great. And this one's for Jen. Do the citations, the legal research that you can have done as a service, do they include GDPR, CCPA, and ISO record keeping requirements? I think I know the answer to the first two. And
yes, absolutely. So definitely GDPR, not only at the supranational level for the European Union, the GDPR itself, but also all of the kind of iterations that the member countries have implemented. Those are laws that we're capturing. CCPA, definitely. ISO, yes. It's kind of, one of those circumstances. I think ISO as well is, it's proprietary in nature. It does have some record keeping requirements. And we've kind of had clients come to us and say, hey, here's, here it is. Can we get this? Enter it in, and can you consider it, provide recommendations based on that? So we have captured some of those ISO requirements, and we do consult on those as well.
Okay. This one's an interesting one. I think that shows sort of, I think, an underlying common misconception about retention schedules. In a comprehensive schedule, would all schedules have a legal citation, or can you have schedules without a legal requirement, was the question. Warren, do you want to take this one?
Sure, yeah, and that's actually a pretty interesting one. The numbers that I've heard is somewhere around 40 to 60% of the items in a schedule can have an actual legal requirement. So as you can tell from that, sometimes the majority of your records actually are just based on business requirements, your own internal requirements for, audits or just keeping things for your own records. So
operational considerations. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's often thought that the majority have some sort of legal requirement, or maybe everything is just 7 years, but that's usually not the case. In fact, I'd be curious to know, Greg, from your field experience, how that plays out in your particular environment, because I'm just kind of throwing out some random numbers, not random, but average numbers. So I'm curious if that rings true in your world.
To a certain extent, we are pretty heavily regulated in most of what we do. So we do have citations, but there are some that we actually use industry best practice for. So we'll create a citation that we can track, and it would be more for best practices, what the business wants.
And it's, I guess, on those too that you would have some more wiggle room from the perspective of bucketing a little bit more easily as well.
Right.
I would think so, yeah.
Yeah.
So once you have, this one's for you again, Warren, once you have simplified and managed schedule, how do users apply the schedule to documents and to automate deletion?
Oh,
So
yeah.
this is the operationalizing part.
That's the $64,000 question, or maybe it's $1 million now. I don't know, but
It's million.
yeah, and some of that will depend on the size of your organization, the number of applications you have in play. I would say by and large, most people right now are just applying them manually. So they are developing the retention schedule in either a tool like ours or in a spreadsheet, and then once it's published or approved, they will manually go update various systems that have retention capabilities, and that's the typical way that it's done. But outside of that, what we're trying to do is elevate the level of automation for our customers in the sense that through APIs or through database integrations, we want to basically make it so you have one place to manage the schedule, and then when you publish that, the other systems are automatically updated through these APIs or these connectors, essentially, so that if the tool that you have documents in has retention capabilities, then let's try to automate that retention update so you're not having to manually do it. Because as you can imagine, if you are not pushing those retention schedules out to the various systems, then your level of compliance is really in question. How effective is the update? How often is it being done? Are you checking in on it? All those factors can really reduce the level of compliance if you're not getting all those updates out in a timely manner.
And that manual, if you're doing it manually, that can be an incredibly heavy lift.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, if you've only got 10 applications, that's not too much of a problem. But if you've got 100 or 200, I've got customers who have 2,500 to 3,000 applications that they're managing. So not all of those, of course, will have retention capabilities. But if even a third of them do, that's a lot to manage.
That's a lot, and it's also a lot to take off your plate if you can. So that actually, I think you've covered two of the next questions, which were about those connectivities. So is there anything you can do with the schedule of that? Sorry, to help people. This is, I think, operationalizing from a personal perspective, communications and change management, to help people bridge the gap between recognizing the categories in the schedule that relate to their data in their system. So do you have any tips basically on how best to educate the end users?
Yeah, I mean, there's really sort of a mapping process that has to happen there. And part of that is a matter of kind of going back to how you design the schedule. In other words, does it functionally match what people recognize and be able to search on the right terms in order to find it? But I would also say that part of that goes back to maybe one of the fundamental things, which is in the very beginning, it's often a good practice to do a data inventory and be able to map the inventory of all your systems and your repositories back to the retention schedule. And if you can create a link in that retention schedule to those systems, that's even better. So if you look up those employment applications and be able to have a reference in your retention schedule to say, oh, well, we store those in these 3 different systems or on the shared drive, wherever it might be, that makes it a lot easier for people to know where and how to apply those retention policies.
So some more targeted educational training for the specific users. So
and some additional metadata points.
So the next one is, do you recommend setting up a master set of retention schedules to capture retention periods by function and then break those down by program? And I think what this person, we were trying to figure out specifically what this question was getting at, but I think it's the discussion of what's the best approach, functional approach, department or program approach, and again, some of those terms may be different within a specific organization. Jen, can you tell us what your thoughts are, what you've seen out there, and if you have any particular thoughts on like perceptions of which is easier from what perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what we have seen is, as some of our clients are kind of getting up to speed and coming to us and asking for help, they're saying we want to transition from this massive departmental schedule to functional. We go through that process, and of course there is, a huge kind of learning curve for end users. This is a completely new kind of concept. It's organized different. There's definitely a training component to make that retention schedule successful. But what we've also seen is, as a way to kind of bridge that gap, is that, you know, there's kind of methods, I think, to provide some extra end user guidance. While we don't want to kind of revert back to departmental and break anything out or duplicate anything, you know, within the schedule, you know, there's definitely, for example, fields within our software. We can tag different business areas where a record series is relevant or a function is relevant. You know, you can limit views so that, you know, people in different business areas, for example, can only see accounting, tax, and you know, HR, because those are the only areas that are relevant for them. So I think that there's some, you know, different approaches. We can still keep that functional schedule, but provide some guidance that, you know, that will kind of be specific for those business areas and help them really hone in on the areas of the retention schedule that's relevant for them.
And Greg, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on this, what you, from a practitioner perspective, what works best from your sense? I mean, both as a practitioner, the person applying this schedule, but also, you know, in terms of questions you receive, do you find one approach or another better?
We decided to go by function, in some cases process. So a records retention schedule could contain more than just one department, right? So I find that by doing it by process and or function, that you can kind of find where the records are generated easier than just by a department, so to speak.
Okay. And this one, while I have you on the hook here, just this one also is for you. Is it possible to manage a global retention schedule on your own? So you have a big one to manage, or several, I think, right? So do you think, can you do it on your own? Is this a one-man operation?
Well, I know we couldn't. You know, doing business in over 80 countries would be pretty crazy. And I guess it depends upon what you mean by on your own, right? Does that mean no tools, like as for instance, like a Zazio, right? If that's the case and all you have is the internet, I put in a search that said how long to retain employment records in Brazil, right? So, you know, what's your retention period for employee records? I came back with 203 million hits. So imagine one title for one function and having to parse through all that. What's legitimate, what's not, you know, what have you, and then keeping it up to date. And then do your day job, right? So,
and that's many people's full-time day jobs, right?
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, unless you have an army of folks doing this for you, no, you need some kind of tool to work through this.
Yeah, and that has been my personal experience, that it rapidly gets out of hand for one person to do it, and it's not just a question of it's a question of both the expertise in that particular jurisdiction as well as language barriers. So here's an interesting one that I think some of us, I'm sure you've encountered this with clients who are doing this, and I've encountered it myself. If you have to work off of an Excel spreadsheet, any tips to be sure you stay up on top of departmental updates when doing an inventory for the enterprise? Or, you know, how do you manage a records retention schedule basically in Excel? Warren, thoughts on that?
Well, we chuckle, but I would say, you know, 90% of the prayer certainly helps.
Yeah, really.
90% of the organizations that we work with
start that right.
They start that way, or they're still doing it that way, even if they're, you know, global international companies, just because it's a simple format that everybody understands. It's recognizable, and, you know, to be honest, it works quite well if you have a relatively small schedule. You know, it's easy to sort and search and function and filter and so forth. But once you get into those international scopes, it becomes just so unwieldy, because trying to cross-reference the you know, the various record types with the different exceptions, you end up with multiple spreadsheets, or at least multiple worksheets, and trying to navigate between those becomes just very unwieldy. So, I mean, it can be done, and it's done all the time. It's just not very efficient, and you have issues with being able to share the spreadsheet. Does it get corrupted? Does somebody update it when they're not supposed to? Which version is the correct version? do you have an audit trail of who changed what? All of those things, when you start to look at it, become very problematic when it comes to being compliant, facing audits, all of those issues that you deal with as a multinational organization or even a small organization.
Mm-hmm. So our next two questions are about specific retention periods. So does anyone have a record retention on social media or texting? How long do you keep? And how long do you need to keep hard copies and digital? And so my immediate thoughts on this are that it shouldn't be based on the medium, but the content, and what is it? Does anyone else have any thoughts on that?
I'll throw that one to Jen. I think you've probably dealt with it more than I have, at least in terms of the retention periods, Jen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that fundamentally you go to that question about, what is the content?
Mm-hmm.
I think more so what we see our clients doing and we recommend is really try to control this by policy as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
You really want to keep kind of substantive business records off of social media or texting or, your BYODs or your collaboration sharing platforms. So policy really, I think, provides really great guidance for, end users. And then really the idea is that anything that would be subject to the retention schedule is kind of saved separately and in accordance with the records retention schedule, going back to that content.
So keeping some of those chat functions and things like that for the chatting sort of capability that they're meant to be. Don't conduct business on them, and then enforce that, so that you can imply you would be able to deploy a shorter retention period. And I think that goes also with the hard copy and digital. One of the issues there is sort of what is that hard copy? There may be instances in which you can get rid of it if you've made an appropriate conversion to digital, but in other cases you might need to keep it. But again, I think it depends on the content of the record and what your policy is, why you're keeping that record. So the next question here is, does anyone know where I could find an example of retention schedule for financial services and credit unions? And I'll just take a quick point on that. Is there are often industry groups out there, certainly for the pharmaceutical and biotech industry. There are groups, and I believe there are some for the financial services industry, and we also have at ARMA have industry groups that you can join, and there is one in financial services, so you might want to check that out. I know that there's pretty good collaboration amongst people within the same industry. Jen and Warren, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I know that we've often had customers or prospects ask us about just sort of industry standard templates and so forth, and the idea always sounds good, but it's really difficult to nail down a standard, so to speak, because every business is different. It depends on where you have operations, what kind of operations you have. Are you dealer broker? Are you a bank? Are you an insurance company? All of those different things will affect how you keep records and where you keep them and who has jurisdictions and so on. And
it's certainly not, it's never one size fits all. It's a good maybe start off point. Right. And then you have to tailor it certainly to the specifics of your organization, including all of those other categories that have nothing to do with the specific requirements.
And sometimes what happens is when there is a template, an attempt at a template, in order to cover the legal aspects of that, you have to make the coverage so broad that you really have many more categories than you want, and so you still end up having to pare that down to just what's what's necessary.
I think that we often get this question. We have clients asking for templates, and in some instances, there's kind of depending on the business, there's a way, I think, there, but ultimately we always kind of work with them to really tailor it to their organization. I mean, that's kind of where we always end up.
So let's see, we're almost done with these questions. Wow. So does anyone know where I could find an example? I'm sorry, I did that one. Sorry, I apologize. If we have a retention requirement that runs counter to compelled destruction requirements, which takes precedence? Jen, do you have thoughts on that one?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So one thing that we note in most of the compelled destruction requirements is they have kind of a carve out for other legal requirements.
Right.
For example, that Utah requirement I mentioned earlier, you know, there's a carve out for that. You know, same thing for the Illinois biometrics, you know, like FINRA, for example, requires fingerprints to be retained for broker dealers for a certain amount of time. You know, so that would be a carve out if it needs to be kept longer. So I think that's one thing we always look to first, is to find, you know, is there kind of, does it grant exceptions for other legal requirements? And generally they do.
Does anyone else have anything to add to that?
I know from what I've seen, sometimes those compelled destructions end up breaking down some of the big buckets into a little bit smaller buckets because of those exceptions. So we have seen some of that as a trend.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Warren. And, you know, to that point, you know, more and more we're seeing biometric record series in client schedules because it is highly sensitive personal information and it's being so strictly regulated, not only internationally, but now we're seeing more and more in the States too. So it really makes sense to kind of break that information out.
All right. Here's the next one here. Should a retention program prioritize the deleting of documents after they have expired or prioritize the retaining of documents per their legal requirements? In other words, is there more risk of deleting too soon or keeping too long? And I think that's an interesting question. It's about striking the balance. I think it also really depends on the nature of the records, I think specifically that we're talking about. Jen, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that the safest bet is really to make sure you're following your policy, and that your policy is being refreshed on a periodic basis, taking into account all of those legal requirements as well as, you know, the business operational requirements of the business. And I think as long as you're really kind of on top of that and maintaining your policy, really just stick to your policy as much as possible.
Okay.
I would add that it kind of depends on what you're worried about. You know, are you more worried about what someone will find, or are you worried about what you might lose?
Right. And I think, again, that goes to I think that really hits heavily on the sort of nature of the record you're talking about specifically. And obviously you want a policy that's developed around those specific record types. So I think there's some types of records that create more risk when they're over retained than others, and vice versa potentially.
I think, you know, going back to the social media and text messages and so forth, and I would put email in that category too. That's one of those things where, especially like email, the trend, you know, years ago was just to keep it all just in case. Then they realized that there were a lot of litigation issues over that because it was being used against them. And so now it's more like, okay, let's get rid of that as soon as we can.
And some of that I think about just as a risk from a volume perspective. You know, you've hung on to this sort of potentially negligible value record for a longer period than you need to, and then litigation hits and now you have to go through that. So it just can be voluminous, and also depending on the media type too, difficult to review and piece together the conversation. So I think we've evolved pretty well in email in putting together threads of a communication and you know, streamlining that process. But I don't think we've, you know, integrated as well all of the newer modes of communication. So they're difficult to get through if you have to. This is our last question. With the collection of sensitive information such as biometrics in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, have organizations been forced to review their retention schedule to address privacy considerations? I'm just curious too, if you have any thoughts or comments on the retention of all of these new records that we're creating with regard to you know, to COVID. So I think every place you go now, people are, you know, either asking for doing a temperature check, either asking to do some kind of questionnaire. Have you traveled here, been exposed to X? And so upon entry to buildings, any thoughts on one, the first part of this question, has it forced people to review their retention schedules a little bit more carefully about those privacy considerations, and then any thoughts you might have on the retention of that information?
Yeah, I can kind of speak to that. We started this virtual coffee series, and it just kind of happened to align with, you know, the start of the pandemic. And we spent several series talking about COVID records.
Right.
And I don't think in my RIM career, I've really had the opportunity to, you know, kind of look at or deal with something as substantial as this, where it's like, you know, introducing a completely kind of new type of almost like medical record or record to the retention schedule to this degree, I guess. There's always things that come up, you know, with different laws, but it was definitely a sense of urgency surrounding this. They're like, we're creating all these and collecting all this records. And I think that people were definitely mostly worried about it because of the privacy implications. So they wanted to make sure they were getting it right. And there are definitely some nuances. We had these conversations about the records, you know, so for example, you know, taking COVID tests, you know, what type of record is this? Is it a medical record? And then we talked about the nuances. Well, if somebody is exposed while they're at the workplace and they have a test to confirm an exposure or disconfirm, then is that rise to the level of an OSHA exposure record because it is a biological agent. But, you know, what if we have somebody who's been working off site for the past 5 months, now they want to return to work. As part of their return to work, they have to, you know, have a negative test. That's not really an exposure record, right? Because they haven't been in the workplace. And so, I mean, the importance there is, you know, exposure records have a really long retention period.
Isn't that's very long, right? It's it's decades long after. Is that okay?
Right. Yeah, it's like a
30 years or something.
30 years. Yeah. Yeah. So it really forced people to think, you know, really hard about it and, you know, want to make sure that they were only keeping these records as long as necessary per the legal requirements or other reasons and kind of minimize that risk with over retention. So I think that has been really kind of fascinating and really kind of a test to how much organizations and people are thinking about privacy with regard to the records they're collecting and how they're categorizing them in the retention schedule and making sure that they're not over retaining. So yeah, it's been really interesting. And we still get a lot of questions too.
So I think we're at the end of our questions. Does anyone have? Does any of you have any final thoughts, last words before we end the recording?
It's been a really interesting session. Great questions. Really great to see all the participation. So I've enjoyed the process.
And I just want to thank everyone again for coming. Anybody else? Greg, Jen, thank you so much for being here. Warren, thank you for being here. And we'll get these questions out to everyone really soon. And stay safe, stay well. Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.